Shields and swords, fill the wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and placed, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. 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 Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
Have you ever wondered how books get into the university libraries of the places where you're researching or writing your research papers? Now, this seems like a really esoteric question, but I think this gets at helping us understand what books are valuable for and what they are not valuable for. So let's talk about what happens, how a book gets there. Well, the first thing that's going to happen is a writer's going to have an idea. So I have an idea for a book and I'm going to write the book. Sometimes I'll write the whole thing. Sometimes I'll write part of it and then send that part to a publisher and get their approval, and I'll finish writing it. But one way or the other, it's going to take me about 2 years to write a book, in most cases. So after those 2 years are done, it doesn't just appear in the library. Next, a publisher has to decide that they want to publish it. And when they decide that they want to publish it, they're either going, it's going to take some time. Now, most things that are sent in for publication are not published. Sometimes they're not published because they're bad. Sometimes they're not published because it's not exactly what the publisher wants to publish. It's not exactly what they do. And sometimes it's not published because what you don't know is they've already agreed to publish one or two other books on the same subject, but they just haven't appeared in print yet. But let's assume that they want to publish it. Usually they don't, but let's say that they do. Once they do, what's next? Do they publish it? No. Now they're going to assign an editor to you. And that professional editor is going to work with you and negotiate with you to turn your original manuscript into what's going to end up being the final version of the book. Great. Now the book is written, the book is edited, and the book is published. So it appears on the university library shelves, right? Still no. Because now no one has yet bought the book. So usually what's going to happen at this point is publishers will send out these flyers or little catalogs of their latest holdings. And they'll send mass emails and other things to professors like me saying, hey, would you be interested in our book? Why don't you look at our book? Why don't you read our book? And most of the time, I'm not going to buy the books that they suggest. Sometimes some schools will have a budget for a professor to buy a certain amount of money in books. Some schools will have no budget for that. But either I have a very limited budget or I'm using my personal money to buy the book. And if that's the case, I'm only going to buy a book if I'm pretty sure I want to read it. So let's say that I do buy a book, like one of these many, many books behind me, because I do want to read it. Now I read the book. And the next thing that happens is I haven't just read the book and liked the book. I thought, I think my students should read this book. That's the next step. I think my students should read this book. So what happens then? Well, now I'm going to send in a request to the library to buy the book. And most of the time, the library will not buy the book. And they won't buy the book because they have limited budget. And so they're going to have to decide, well, we bought so many chemistry books last semester. This semester we're going to have to buy more books on marketing or however they're going to make that decision. It's not really based on who's requesting what so much as what do they see they have holes in their collection and what do they need to fill in for those holes. I've talked over the years with various university librarians here and other places, and I usually hear numbers around like say 30% of requests, or maybe a third of all requests are filled, which means most of the time, even if I suggest a book to the library, they're not going to buy it because they're going to just not have enough money to buy everything that I would love my students to have access to. And then finally, the book is purchased and it ends up in the library shelves, waiting for you, the student, to come along and pick it up or to read the electronic version of it. Okay, so why did I tell you all this? Well, I told you all this to point out two things. First of all, it takes a long time for a book to enter onto the library shelves. And the second thing is, there are a lot of gatekeepers who are putting their money or their reputation on the line for this book. So it's either, the professor who buys the book with his own money or his own budget, the library that buys a copy of the book with their budget, the publisher whose reputation and their finances are on the line for the success or failure of this book, the editor who it's their job. If they do a bad job with the book, they're going to lose their job. There are also all sorts of people who have a real stake in this book being successful and have decided, yes, I think this book is successful, will be successful. If not financially successful, will at least be successful in maintaining the reputation of our university or our publishing house or what have you. So what this means is that if you enter into a university library and you look at a book on a shelf, the scholarship there is probably valid. Now, I say valid rather than right or good because it could be wrong. The things that they claim could be wrong, but they've at least arrived at them in a scholarly way. At least at some point, someone looked at this and said, yes, this is a valid thing that people need to look at. Now, of course, it's painting with a very broad brush. Sometimes, you'll have historical documents or other kinds of archival things, which are there for you to have reference to. I'm sure that every decent university library has a copy of, say, Mein Kampf. It doesn't mean that that every university library is, supporting Nazism, but simply that they know that their students should have access to this book should they end up doing research involving Nazism or Adolf Hitler or something along these lines, right? So there are a lot of gatekeepers. And so by and large, you can trust the books you find in a university library to have at least been valid at one time or another. However, what's the big problem? Well, see how many years it has taken, right? It takes 2 years just to write the book. And then by the time you get to the publishing from publishing and it's sent out, you're looking at probably 5 years between when I thought of the idea to the very first moment it could possibly be pulled by a student off of the shelf. So what that means is some of the ideas will be a little bit dated. Now, in most fields, a little bit dated by 5 years is not really that big of a deal. Only at the very edges of research or at the very edges does something that's 5 years old plus become too old and not matter. In some fields, a thing can be of value for hundreds or thousands of years even. But you do need to be aware that you're not looking at the most recent information on here. It's just the most vetted information. The most people have looked over this and said, yes, this is valid. Whether we agree with it or not, it's at least valid to say, and people need to have access to it. But that vetting takes a lot of time and a lot of money. So when you're looking at a book that you pull off of a shelf on a university library, you can usually trust that it has been through some vetting process and it is probably in some way scholarly. But you have to be careful to make sure that you're not looking at something that is so old that it might be outdated.